Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 161 of the Forge of Freedom. Since our last episode, we had the event in Salem, Indiana with Ed Monk, the church-focused study of the active shooter problem and how to minimize victims. And we had a great event. I want to thank everybody who turned out for that event and supported that event. We had over 70 people make it out for that, and I think that everybody seemed to enjoy it. We got all positive feedback, so I want to thank Ed Monk for coming to present his seminar to us here in Southern Indiana. We had people come in, a couple from Wisconsin and some from up around Indianapolis and Bloomington, a couple of hours away. So people came to take on the responsibility to gain more knowledge to protect themselves and their loved ones, especially in the church context. But Ed's presentations are really applicable in just about any group setting. So thanks again to him, and thanks again to everybody who showed up for that. I will point you to, if you weren't able to make it to that event, Ed was on the Forge of Freedom podcast previously. I believe it was episode 134. I would point you back to that if you want to hear him speak. Of course, that's not his full presentation, but he's been on quite a few podcasts, and of course he was on the Forge of Freedom earlier this year. So I'd encourage you to go back and check that out. His lessons are not complicated, but they're incredibly impactful, and I hope that it motivated people to take the message that the only way to minimize victims is to stop them sooner, and really to hope for less than a double-digit victim count. You have to stop the killer within 30 seconds. And I think once people realize that, it starts to sink in that this is not something that can be accomplished by calling 911. Oftentimes you can't even call 911 within 30 seconds. And once you do get a hold of 911, how many minutes does it take for them to dispatch police and for police to arrive on scene? It may be incredibly quick, but it's going to take much longer than 30 seconds, and you're almost certainly looking at greater than a double-digit victim count in that scenario. So this is not something that can be fixed with better emergency response. It can be helped, but no matter what the scenario is, unless the officer is already on scene when the shooting begins, there is no way for even the best law enforcement to make it on scene through a 911 call to prevent double-digit victim counts. So, again, Ed Monk is from Last Resort Firearms Training in Whitehall, Arkansas. You can find more information about him and what he's up to and his future seminars on his Facebook page. Just search Facebook for Last Resort Firearms Training, and you'll find that information there. So with that said, I've got the topic for today. I'm going to share 10 books with you that I think are some of my favorites, and this list changes from time to time, but some of what I consider to be the 10 best books about liberty. And I'm sharing this because liberty, freedom, is not something that prevails on its own. It's something that has to be fought for, which is the whole theme behind this podcast. The Forge of Freedom is something that there has to be effort. There has to be people who are striving for freedom. And part of that is having the intellectual ammunition, so to speak, to protect the ideas and advance the ideas of freedom. And you can't get that without self-study, without hearing and learning about the moral foundations, the philosophical foundations of freedom and the defense of it. And so I want to share these 10 books that I think are great places to start. Of course, Christmas is just around the corner. If you've got somebody in mind to purchase a book like this for Christmas, it'd be a great gift, a great stocking stuffer, or just a list of books to keep on your radar for future reference. So with that being said, let's get into these books. The first I would mention, and I think it's ironic. I'm a lawyer, but number one is The Law by Frederic Bastiat. And in this book, Bastiat he uses really clear and engaging writing to dismantle the notion that government should redistribute wealth or control economic activities beyond basic human rights. And he introduces concepts like legal plunder, where the law itself becomes the instrument for theft by the government. And Bastiat's famous parable of the broken window illustrates the fallacy of economic policies that create short-term gains at the expense of long-term prosperity. And this book, I think, is crucial for understanding the moral and economic arguments against state intervention. Because part of the point he's making here, as I've alluded to, is that the law becomes the instrument that the government uses to plunder certain parts of society for its own use, for its own benefit, for politicians to play sort of puppets with society. We'll take your money by law, and then we'll redistribute it in a way that gives us control, that in ways that we can incentivize people to act certain ways or not to act in certain ways. And so I think Bastiat's book here is crucial for helping understand the mechanism by which the government uses the law for that purpose. The next book, The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman. Here Friedman, he takes readers on a bit of a thought experiment where government is replaced by a system of voluntary contracts, arbitration rather than court process or litigation, and private security rather than government provided or government implemented, I should say, law enforcement. And he discusses how legal systems might operate in a free market, how public, so-called public goods could be provided without coercion, like roads, for instance, or pseudo-public goods like utilities, and even how environmental issues could be addressed through property rights. I think this is, this part is really interesting as well. When you think about environmentalism, I would consider myself a bit of an environmentalist. I care about the environment. I think that we should be good stewards of the place where we live. But I don't think of myself as an environmentalist in the sort of colloquial sense, or the sense in which you hear it in the media most times, where people try to get the government to implement this or that policy for this or that pet project that they may have. And I think that the government approach to so-called environmentalism is often more damaging than if the government had just stayed out of the arena of protecting the environment to begin with. So anyway, I love this sort of private property rights approach to protecting the environment. But Friedman's approach here, he combines economic theory with practical examples, making really a fascinating read for people who are curious about life without traditional government. How would we have roads? How would we have security or the protection of property rights? How could we resolve legal disputes? Those sorts of things that people traditionally think of as services or mechanisms provided by the government. I think this book really sort of opens people's mind to other possibilities. We've lived in a society, in a system where government has provided these things for so long that I think people struggle to think in creative ways or ways that are outside of the box that are really almost certainly better than what we currently have through government. So the third book, For a New Liberty, the Libertarian Manifesto by Murray Rothbard. In this book, Rothbard outlines a vision, a fairly comprehensive vision for a libertarian society, and he addresses every aspect from defense to education, from crime prevention to welfare. And his argument for a society based on voluntary association and the non-aggression principle is, I think, fairly provocative and compelling. The book not only critiques state action, but offers a concrete alternatives, including his views on the illegitimacy of taxation and the potential for private courts and defense agencies. So this one kind of goes hand in hand with The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman, but both provide this vision of a world with more voluntary association rather than government coerced association. Number 4, The Ethics of Liberty, again by Murray Rothbard, this one written nearly 10 years later. Building on his previous works, Rothbard delves into the philosophical and ethical reasons why libertarianism should be the guiding political philosophy. And I want to, just for a moment, pause there and say, I talk a lot about libertarianism on this podcast, and I consider myself a libertarian in the small L sense. I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. But libertarianism is just that, a political philosophy. It's not a comprehensive worldview. There's still room within libertarianism or before libertarianism, outside of libertarianism, for other aspects of a comprehensive worldview. For instance, what's your faith? Do you follow or practice any particular religion? What other moral principles do you hold that are not political principles? So libertarianism, I want to emphasize, it's just that it's a political philosophy, not a comprehensive worldview. Nevertheless, Rothbard in this book explores issues like property rights, punishment, war, children's rights. What rights do children have? And always from the perspective of natural law ethics. His argument that all rights stem from self-ownership, I think, is pivotal. And I remember I discussed this with Michael Rechtenwald on a previous podcast, that oftentimes you'll hear libertarians talk about the non-aggression principle as the foundation of libertarianism, which is the idea that people should be free to act as long as they don't aggress against another person. But really, it stems first and foremost from this idea from the natural law of self-ownership. And he talks about what the natural law is, and this concept of self-ownership, the idea that nobody on earth has a superior right to my body than myself, no other person. You may believe, depending on your faith, that God has a greater right to your body, but nevertheless, no other person has a greater right to you or your body. And so that's the premise of this idea of self-ownership. But in this book, The Ethics of Liberty, he offers a fairly rigorous, I think, in my estimation, defense of libertarian principles against various ethical objections. So highly encourage you to check out that book. And I've referenced that book in a number of previous podcasts as well. The fifth book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia by Robert Nozick. Nozick's work here is best known for its entitlement theory, which argues that only a minimal state can be justified. So within libertarianism, there's often this divide between people who consider themselves to be anarchists, people who believe that any form of government is unethical, and not anarchy in the sense that it's normally portrayed by the media or government officials. It's not chaos. Libertarians don't believe that anarchy leads to chaos. Anarchy seems it merely means without a ruler, anarcheia. And so it just means that people cannot rule over others except in voluntary arrangements. And so then it's not even ruling in the sense that we normally think about it. But then there are others who think, libertarians who believe that in something called minarchy, which is a minimal government society. And today we live so far from either state, from either of these conditions, that I think that the debate about what the ideal society is useful, but I don't think it's useful as a insofar as it results in separation or division among the Libertarian Party, because I think that people should realize that from a realistic perspective, from a practical perspective, people who want more freedom should want a society with far less government than what we have today. And so our focus should be on scaling back the current government, on cutting away as much as possible until we get to the point where we say, okay, actually, this is just the right amount. And I believe that once we get to that point, we might find out that actually anarchy is the proper form in society, where people voluntarily interact, and there are these voluntary cooperative mechanisms to enforce private contracts, etc. But we may find out that actually, no, we do need some government, but only for very limited purposes. Generally, the minimal government libertarians will say we need it for courts to have a neutral arbiter to decide legal disputes. We need a minimal military simply for defense and truly for defense, not offensive purposes under the guise of defense like we have today, and policing. Now, again, there's a lot of debate there about what the extent of each of those should be, but the minimal government libertarians believe that those are the only three functions that government should engage in. All right, number 6. And actually, before I move on to number 6, going back to Anarchy, State, and Utopia, again, here Nozick, he's advocating for a minimal state, and that it argues that that's the only form of state that can be justified. And that's a state that doesn't distribute anything by force, but protects against force fraud, and theft. And he uses I think, a thought-provoking narrative style in this book to discuss how wealth distribution should occur naturally through voluntary exchanges. Nozick also explores here the concept of a utopia where people can live in communities of their choosing based on their values. So that's a great, I think, thought-provoking book as well. Number 6, The Constitution of Liberty by F.A. Hayek. Here Hayek argues for a legal and political framework where freedom is maximized. He discusses how liberty is not just about the absence of coercion, but requires a specific structure of laws to prevent power from being concentrated in any one group. Hayek's critique of social justice and his advocacy for spontaneous order lay a foundational critique against planned economies and centralized control, advocating for evolutionary processes in both law and economics, more organic processes. And this is an interesting book to read, especially if you've ever read anything from Lysander Spooner, who has said that basically the founders had a vision for what the Constitution would do in terms of being a control against itself. So the idea that the founders were cognizant of and very weary of was that they believed we needed a government, because they believed that if people were inherently good, that there would be no need for government. But because people are not good, there has to be some mechanism to control or minimize that tendency to do bad. But by the same token, they realized that in order to make a government composed of bad men to control bad men, you had to implement or institute a government that could control itself. And so that was the whole idea behind the separation of powers and the 3 different branches of government and all of these controls built into the Constitution to try to limit the expansion, the deterioration, and the corruption of government. Lysander Spooner would argue that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution has been powerless to prevent that, because it was perverted almost from the instant that the government took form. And I think he has a lot of support for that argument. Nevertheless, I do think that the spirit of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights carries on to some degree and acts as a control only insofar as the populace understands it and embraces it. So I do think that the Constitution has had some effect, but I agree that it hasn't and didn't act as the control that the founders had hoped, at least as well as they had hoped. Nevertheless, I do think it's better than any form of government, at least initially, that the world has known. Of course, there is no good government. There's only bad government. The question is, to what degree is government necessary, if at all? And so Hayek does a good job exploring those ideas in the Constitution of Liberty. Number 7, Human Action, a Treatise on Economics by Ludwig von Mises. Of course, as you know, if you've been following the podcast for any length of time, I share quite a few articles from the Mises Institute, Mises.org, and that's largely because when I was in college, I read Human Action which was it's a large book, but it was gifted to me by Aaron Sperling, who was on the podcast, one of the early episodes about Stoicism. And this book changed the way not only that I look at economics, but how I look at government, how I look at the world, how I look at people, and how I look at the way that people interact, and how government perverts those interactions in almost every aspect of our lives. But here Mises provides an extensive foundation for economic theory based on praxeology, which is just the study of human action. And this book explores how human choices driven by subjective values, so what I value is going to be different than what somebody else values, and or value differently. I may value my car just like somebody else values a car, but I may value it more than they do, or vice versa. And how these subjective valuations lead to economic phenomena like prices, money, and business cycles. And Mises's emphasis on the impossibility of central economic planning due to what he calls the knowledge problem is central to libertarian critiques of state intervention in markets. And that's just the idea that there is no way one person or some collective group of so-called experts in DC or wherever they are can account for the subjective valuations that each and every person in the world have. And they cannot account for the decentralized knowledge that each and every person has, acting voluntarily, acting due to the circumstances of their life from various places throughout the world, and acting based on the presence, the availability of various resources. So I think that Mises does an incredible job here. And you'd think this is a treatise on economics, that this would be some dry or boring read, but it's really not. It's much more engaging, much more interesting than you might think a treatise on economics would be. And like I said, I could hardly put the book down when I first read it because it was so, I'd never heard anything like this before. Of course, the conventional economics that's taught in high school and in most colleges, it is nothing like what Mises has to offer in his book, Human Action. And of course, the economics that's taught in high school and in college is generally posited in a way that says, okay, based on these governmental priorities and these theories in economics, how can the government impose or try to achieve those priorities? And that's not all it is, but that's often the way that it's taught or viewed. And so many economists go on to become basically lackeys for the government, coming up with justifications or theory for whatever policy the government wants to pursue, rather than stepping back and looking at the bigger picture about how humans interact, about how prices come about organically, and about how markets work through voluntary exchange. I think that this is part of what I've talked about before as well, the fatal conceit that centralized policymakers have. They believe that, I'm educated, I've got a degree in economics, I've got a degree in public policy, I know what's good for society, I know what's good for everybody out there. But they can't account for the subjective valuations of every person and what every person wants out of their life. And inevitably, they're wrong about their ability to centrally plan and manage an economy. And it stems from this fatal conceit, this belief that they have the knowledge, they have the ability to plan an economy in a centralized manner. Number 8, The Market for Liberty by Linda and Morris Tannehill. The Tannehills envision a society where all services, and you see a theme here, this is the third or fourth book I've mentioned like this, including those traditionally provided by government, like law enforcement and courts, are handled through market mechanisms. They argue that competition would lead to better service, accountability, and innovation in these areas. Their vision includes how arbitration might replace state courts, how private defense agencies could maintain peace, and how all this would lead to a more just society. Now, we see a lot of these things, private security and arbitration and so on, taking place anyway outside of the government-provided services, because the government-provided services are so bad, whether it's the courts or the government-provided law enforcement. The people who need these services are already paying for them, but because they're so bad, they will pay again to have the private market alternative to get an actual quality service. So what if we just eliminated the government service to begin with and started with the private sector to begin with? There would be far more efficiency, and these services would be provided in a manner that the consumer wanted them to be provided, not in the one-size-fits-all approach that government always takes. Number 9, The Revolution, a Manifesto by Ron Paul. Here, Ron Paul's manifesto is a call to return to the founding principles of the United States, where he advocates for minimal government, strict adherence to the Constitution, non-interventionist foreign policy, and sound money. It's not only a political critique, but also an educational tool explaining libertarian principles through the lens of American history and current events. His straightforward style here, I think, makes complex ideas relatively accessible to a broad audience. So even if you have no formal education or very little exposure to political philosophy or economics, I think that Ron Paul's book here provides straightforward access to those concepts. Because let's face it, I think that's part of what the government does using their so-called experts, is they try to make ideas and theories so complicated that most people just give up. But what people don't understand is that the government wants you to look over, I think, intentionally or unintentionally, the basic foundations of liberty in economics. And I think that anybody can understand the concepts that Ron Paul is talking about, that Hayek is talking about, that Mises is talking about, and so on in many of these books. They're not highly technical works. And that, I think that's one of the misconceptions, is that economics doesn't have to be highly technical to understand it at a high level. Okay. Now, if you want to get into, complex business planning, etc., that's a different story. But understanding foundational economic principles, I think, is accessible to anyone. And finally, number 10, Our Enemy, the State by Albert J. Nock. Here, Nock presents a historical and philosophical argument that the state, by its nature, is an adversary to individual liberty. He contrasts society and voluntary interaction with the state and coercive power throughout history, showing how the state has grown at the expense of freedom. Nock's writing is both cynical, but I think still eloquent and beautiful, offering a timeless critique of government expansion and a call for a reevaluation of what true governance should look like. So there you go. There's 10 books, and like I said, if you ask me again next week what my top 10 books would be, I'd probably, my list would be a little bit different. Nevertheless, and these are not in any particular order, I would, matter of fact, probably put Mises's Human Action much higher than number 7. But I've compiled a list here of what I believe to be some of the best classic works in libertarianism and the ideas of freedom. Like I said at the beginning, freedom won't live on by itself. Government is the mechanism by which everyone tries to live at the expense of everyone else. That's what it's become. Of course, that's not what the founders intended. The founders intended, as you'll understand if you read Ron Paul's book, especially The Revolution, was to have a very limited government that protected people from each other. But what the government has become is a mechanism by which people abuse each other and steal from each other through the mechanism of government, through politicians. And that has obviously been perverted in a way that the founders never intended. And as I alluded to earlier, anarchists would tell you that that's a fool's errand is to create a government that restrains the bad parts of human nature and also restrains itself. But as people like Ron Paul would say, it's not a futile endeavor, but it's one that we have to ever more persistently strive for. Either way, it's important for people to be acquainted with, to be familiar with the ideas and the foundations of liberty. Because if we're not, we're susceptible to the propaganda that the government is always putting forth and polluting society with. So with that in mind, I'd encourage you to go check out these books, buy them for yourself, buy them for your loved ones. That's how we advance the ideas of liberty. It's by sharing these ideas as far and as widely as we can. Next week, actually at the suggestion of my father, I liked his idea, I'm going to dive into the drug war a little bit more. There was a recent news story near where we live about a big drug bust. And I want to talk about the futility and sort of the showmanship of the war on drugs. I'll put it that way. That's the nicest way I think I can put it. But anyway, I'm going to get into that news story and talk a little bit more about some of the lessons that we can learn from that news story. And then I want to get back to the topic of firearms again in the not too distant future. I want to talk a little bit in a couple weeks about an update about what's going on at the Supreme Court with the Second Amendment. So until then, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of liberty. If you haven't already left us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, I'd really appreciate it if you could do that. It helps let people know that this is content worth listening to. As always, you can find the podcast on YouTube, Rumble, Facebook, and X at Forge of Freedom. You can also find the podcast on all the most popular streaming platforms and at forgeoffreedom.com, where we always have the full show notes, including all of the links to the books that I've referenced in this podcast. All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.